The cold is the first thing. It comes through the floor of the aircraft in a way that has nothing to do with weather. A mechanical cold, engine deep, rising through the metal and into the bones of every man sitting along the fuselage. The Whitley shudders and dips, and the men sway together in the dark like something tethered loosely to the airframe. No one speaks. There's nothing left to say. He can feel the weight of everything he is carrying. Sten gun across his chest, grenades heavy against his ribs, ammunition pouches pulling at his webbing. The parachute harness cuts into his shoulders and thighs in the way it always does, and he shifts against it without thinking, the way a man shifts in a saddle on a long ride. Beside him, a knee presses into his. Someone adjusts a strap. The smell is oil and canvas and the sour residue of rum-laced tea, still faintly warm somewhere at the back of his throat. Ahead, through the dimness of the fuselage, he can see the dispatcher crouched near the hole. The aperture, a square of black nothing cut into the floor of the aircraft, and beyond it, only air. He's jumped before. He has sat in this exact position, in this exact aircraft, and watched that square of darkness and told himself it's just a door. But it's not just a door. It's a hole in the bottom of a bomber at several hundred feet, and the wind that rises from it sounds like something tearing. The aircraft banks gently and the engine note changes. They're close. He knows this not because anyone has said so, because the quality of the air has shifted. The flak that rattled against the fuselage minutes ago has stopped, and the silence it leaves behind is worse. Silence means they're past the coast. Silence means France is underneath them. He thinks of the model at the table at Thruxton, the villa on the cliff top, the enclosure in the trees, the little cove at the beach at the bottom, all of it laid out in miniature, clean and precise, as though the wall was something that could be measured with a ruler. He has studied it until he could walk it blind. Every man here has. And now the model is behind them, and the real thing is below them, buried somewhere under snow and moonlight. He is aware, in the way that a man becomes aware of very simple things at very specific moments, that nothing will look the way it did on the table. The dispatcher raises his hand. Red light. The men in front of him begin to move. Not quickly. There is no rush to this, only sequence. One after another, they shuffle forward on the metal floor, legs stiff, equipment clattering softly, each man closing the gap between himself and the hole. He moves with them. The cold air from the aperture hits his face and he can see it now. The faintest silver light below. The snow-covered ground impossibly far beneath them. The moon picking out the edges of fields and hedgerows in a pale wash that makes everything look like something remembered rather than something real. The man ahead of him reaches the edge. He does not look down. His boots are at the rim and his hands are at his sides and he is perfectly still. And then the light turns green and the dispatcher's arm drops and the shout comes. A single syllable swallowed instantly by the roar of the engines. And the man is gone. He steps forward. The hole is beneath him. The wind pulls at his legs. Green light. On the night of the 27th of February 1942, 120 British paratroopers dropped into the frozen darkness above northern France. They had been given 3 hours to steal a piece of technology that could change the air war over Europe, and a plan so precise it accounted for every minute between the drop and the dawn. What happened in those 3 hours would become one of the most remarkable small operations of the Second World War, and one of the earliest proofs that airborne soldiers could do what no other force could. So how does a plan built on precision survive the moment it meets the ground? What holds a mission together when the things it depends on the most begin to slip? And what does it mean to keep moving forward when there is no way back? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is the story of the Bruneval Raid. In the winter of 1942, the war in Europe had settled into a shape that favoured no one cleanly. Germany held France, the Low Countries, Norway, and most of the continent west of Moscow. But Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, launched the previous summer with the expectation of a swift collapse, had stalled in the ice and mud of a Russian winter that showed no sign of ending. The Wehrmacht was not beaten, but it was stretched. In the west, Britain held unoccupied, undefeated, but with no realistic prospect of striking back across the Channel. The only offensive tool available to the British was the air, and so the war, for Britain, had become a war of the dark. Every evening, squadrons of Wellingtons and Stirlings and Halifaxes lifted off from airfields across eastern England and flew east into the night, carrying bombs into occupied Europe. The campaign was blunt, costly, and indispensable. It was the only way to hit back, and it was failing. The losses were not sustainable. Night after night, bombers that should have had the protection of darkness were being found, tracked, and shot down with an accuracy that unsettled the men who flew the missions and alarmed the men who planned them. German night fighters seemed to know exactly where the bombers were, not approximately, not eventually, but precisely and in real time. Something was guiding them. Something on the ground was watching the sky. The British understood radar. They had invented it, or at least they had been the first to build a working system and stake a war on it. The Chain Home Network, operational since before the war, had been central to winning the Battle of Britain in 1940. It allowed the RAF to see incoming German formations at distance and concentrate fighters against them with an efficiency that no standing patrol could have matched. Radar had saved the country. The British knew, better than anyone, what it could do in the right hands. And that was precisely why the evidence coming back from the bomber crews was so alarming. Germany was building its own radar network along the western coast of Europe, a long-range early warning system called Freya that could detect aircraft at a considerable distance, and a shorter-range system, more precise, more dangerous, was being used to direct night fighters onto individual bombers with an accuracy that the older system alone could not achieve. The second system was called Würzburg. It was smaller than Freya, easier to manufacture, and far harder to counter, because almost nothing was known about how it worked. British scientists believed they could develop jamming techniques, countermeasures that could blind the radar or confuse it, but to do that, they needed to study the machine itself. They needed components, frequencies, the physical architecture of the thing, and the only way to get that was to take one. The problem was where to find one. Würzburg installations were scattered along the French coast, embedded within the growing belt of fortifications that would later become the Atlantic Wall. Most were too heavily defended, too far inland, or too difficult to reach. But in December of 1941, a reconnaissance Spitfire photographed something on a cliff top 12 miles north of Le Havre, near a small village called Bruneval. The image showed a distinctive disc-shaped antenna, roughly 10 feet across, sitting in the open between a villa and the edge of a 400-foot cliff. Below the cliff, at the base of a narrow ravine, was a small beach, and behind the installation, within reach of open fields, was enough flat ground to serve as a drop zone. It was, by a narrow margin, the most accessible Würzburg site the British had found, and it was the one they would go after. The task fell to combined operations under Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. His planners studied the site and its defences and concluded quickly that a seaborne commando raid was not viable. The cliffs were too steep, the coastal formations too dense, and the time required to fight through them would give the Germans more than enough warning to destroy the radar before it could be reached. If the mission was going to work, it would need to be fast, faster than any approach from the sea could allow. The only option was to come from the air. On the 8th of January, Mountbatten contacted the headquarters of the 1st Airborne Division. The division's commander, Major General Frederick Browning, did not hesitate. British airborne forces were new, untested, and in need of a success that would justify their existence. This was the opportunity. The job was given to C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, a company drawn almost entirely from Scottish infantry regiments. The Black Watch, the Cameron Highlanders, the Seaforth Highlanders, the King's Own Scottish Borderers. They were led by Major John Frost, a 30-year-old officer who had only recently completed his own parachute training. Frost was not a commando, he was an infantryman given command of a company of paratroopers who were themselves only months into their training. The battalion was new, the concept was new. Nothing about this had been proven. Frost divided his 120 men into 5 groups, each named after a Royal Navy admiral. Nelson, under Captain John Ross, would drop near the coast and secure the beach. the only way off the clifftop and the only point where the Royal Navy could extract the force. Jellicoe, under Lieutenant Peter Young, would seize the Würzburg itself. Hardy, Frost's own group, would assault the villa where the German radar operators were quartered. Drake, under Lieutenant Peter Naumoff, would contain the German garrison at a fortified enclosure called Le Pré-Bataire, several hundred yards to the north. And Rodney, under Lieutenant John Timothy, would form a rearguard, protecting the eastern flank against reinforcements. Attached to the force were 10 Royal Engineers, known as sappers, whose job was to help dismantle the radar, and one man who was not a soldier at all. Flight Sergeant Charles Cox was an RAF radar technician, a mechanic, not a paratrooper, who had volunteered to jump into France with C Company, locate the Würzburg, photograph it, and strip it of its most critical components. He had been taught to parachute in a matter of weeks. He had trained the sappers on what a radar set looked like and how to take one apart. He had never seen a Würzburg. No one on the British side had. He would be working on an unfamiliar machine in the dark, under fire, with a set of tools and a pair of specially designed folding trolleys to carry whatever he managed to pull free. The intelligence picture was filled in by the French resistance. An underground network led by Gilbert Renault, known by his code name Remy, had sent agents into the Bruneval area posing as agricultural engineers. They mapped the German positions, identified the garrison's strength and quarters, and confirmed that the beach below the cliffs had not been mined. This last detail mattered enormously. If the beach was mined, the entire extraction plan collapsed. Training was conducted on Salisbury Plain through January and into February. The RAF element fell to 51 Squadron, flying the twin-engined Whitleys that would carry the raiding force under the command of Wing Commander Charles Pickard, a decorated pilot already known to the British public from a wartime propaganda film in which he had played the captain of a Wellington bomber. Pickard's crew and Frost's paratroopers trained together, rehearsing the drop by day and by night, at different altitudes, in fair weather and foul, until the timing between the aircraft and the men jumping from them was as tight as it could be made. On the ground, the company practiced a full assault sequence: jump, rally, move to objective, assault, dismantle, withdraw, again and again, across the open chalk downland that bore the closest resemblance to the terrain around Bruneval. The extraction was the most fragile part of the plan. HMS Prince Albert, a converted Belgian transport, would sail from Portsmouth carrying landing craft and a covering force of 32 men from No. 12 Commando. At the right moment, the landing craft would be lowered and sent towards the beach under their own power, escorted by motor gunboats. The paratroopers would embark from the beach, transfer to the gunboats, and be brought home under destroyer escort. But the entire sequence depended on timing. The landing craft had to arrive at the beach within a narrow window. Too early, and they would be exposed to German fire before the paratroopers were ready. Too late, and the raiding force would be stranded on the beach with reinforcements closing in. There was no margin. If the Navy was not there, there was no other way home. Frost's men spent time in Scotland, at Inverary on Loch Fyne, quartered aboard HMS Prince Albert herself, learning the particular skill of getting themselves and their equipment in and out of the 40-foot landing craft at speed, in the dark, under load. It was not elegant work, but it was essential, because the final minutes of the mission, the transfer from beach to boat, would be the most exposed of all. The final rehearsal took place on the 23rd of February, 4 days before the planned launch. It was a failure. The landing craft sent to practice the beach extraction ran aground on sandbanks 50 metres offshore. The crews could not bring them closer. Had this been the real operation, the entire raiding force would have been stranded on a beach in occupied France with no way home. The problem was noted. It was not solved. There was no time. The operation had to be completed before the end of February, when the combination of moon phase, tide, and weather would not align again for weeks. The force assembled at RAF Thruxton in Hampshire, the airfield from which 51 Squadron would fly them to France. And on the 24th of February, they were stood to. But the weather turned bad. For 3 days, Frost's men prepared each morning and stood down each evening as conditions over the channel refused to clear. By the 27th, Frost had all but assumed the mission would be postponed for a month. Then, in the late afternoon, the word came. The weather had broken. The moon was bright. The wind was low. There was snow on the ground in France, but the sky was clear enough to fly and clear enough to jump. The raid was on. At Thruxton, the men ate bully beef sandwiches and drank tea laced with rum. They loaded themselves into the Whitleys, a slow, awkward process, each man heavy with a parachute, weapons, grenades, and ammunition, and settled into the freezing fuselages for the flight south. 12 aircraft, 120 men, and one radar technician who had never been in combat. Ahead of them, across the channel, the Würzburg sat on its clifftop in the moonlight, turning slowly, watching the sky. And beneath it, the beach waited in the dark. The Whitleys crossed the English Channel at altitude, flying south through clear air above a calm sea. As they reached the French coast, German anti-aircraft batteries opened up, flak bursting in bright clusters around the aircraft, directed with a grim irony by the very radar network the mission had been sent to dismantle. The bombers flew through it. None were hit. The pilots held their course, navigating by moonlight and instruments, and within an hour of leaving Thruxton, the first sticks of paratroopers were falling into the night above Bruneval. Most of the drop was accurate. The fields south of the villa were covered in snow, and the men landed softly. Their dark parachutes, green and blue, chosen to be difficult to see against a night sky, settling around them as they unclipped their harness and gathered their weapons. Frost himself came down on the drop zone and recognised the landmarks he had been briefed to expect. The sudden quiet after the noise of the aircraft was striking. Snow muffled everything. The moonlight was bright enough to read by, and every man on the ground was visible against the white fields, a fact that Frost registered immediately. Whatever chance of surprise they might have had was gone. Their parachutes, their silhouettes, the dark shapes of men moving across open snow, all of it would have been seen by anyone watching. And the Würzburg, sitting on its cliff top a few hundred yards away, had almost certainly tracked the aircraft on the way in. The Germans would know someone was coming. They just would not yet know where from. Frost's own group, Hardy, assembled quickly in a tree line near the drop zone. Jellicoe and Drake formed up nearby. Rodney, the rear guard, was in position. But when Frost looked for Nelson, the group responsible for securing the beach and the evacuation route, the report came back short. Captain Ross had arrived with part of the section, but roughly half of Nelson's men, under Lieutenant Ewan Charters, were not there. They had not arrived at the rally point. They were not on the drop zone. Whether the aircraft had been hit, whether they had been dropped in the wrong place, whether they were dead or scattered or simply lost in the dark, no one knew. 20 men, tasked with clearing the only way off the cliff top, were missing. Frost tried his radios. Nothing. The sets issued to the force had failed. Whether from the cold, the drop, or simple bad luck, they were not working. He had no way to contact Charters. He had no way to reach Nelson at the beach. He had no way to know whether the path to the sea was open or whether his entire force was now stranded on a cliff top in occupied France with no route home. He did not wait. There was no time to wait. The plan depended on speed. The entire operation had been designed around the assumption that the raiding force would be on the ground for less than 3 hours, and every minute spent stationary was a minute in which the German garrison could mobilise. Frost sent Ross forward with what remained of Nelson to begin clearing the beach, and ordered the assault groups to move on the villa and the radar site. Whatever was happening with Charters and the missing men, the mission would continue. The villa sat at the edge of the cliff, pale in the moonlight, with the Würzburg antenna visible just beyond it. A dark disc shape against the sky, mounted on its pedestal between the building and the drop to the sea. Several hundred yards to the north, the enclosure at Le Pré-Bataire was dark and quiet. The plan called for Drake to contain that position, to keep the garrison pinned inside while Hardy and Jellicoe dealt with the villa and the radar. If Drake could not hold them, the entire assault group would be caught in the open between two positions, with fire coming from the front and the flank. The groups separated at the tree line. Drake's men moved north, angling wide through the snow towards Le Pré-Bataire, their shapes dissolving into the dark as they spread into a wide screen along the edge of the enclosure. Jellicoe moved directly towards the Würzburg. Hardy, Frost's group, with Cox and the sappers and the folding trolleys, turned towards the villa. Rodney held the eastern flank, watching the road from which German reinforcements would come. For a brief moment, everything was as it had been on the model at Thruxton. 5 groups, each moving towards a designated position, each with a clear task. The distances between them opening up as they fanned out across the snow. From above, it might have looked clean, orderly, even precise, but on the ground, in the dark, the gaps between the groups felt like absences. The men nearest to him were visible. Everyone else was somewhere out in the white stillness, doing what they were supposed to be doing. Or not. There was just no way to know which. The radios were dead. The plan was the only thing connecting them now. The groups moved forward through the snow. He can feel the snow compact beneath his boots with each step. A faint, dry crunch that sounds enormous in the stillness. The villa is ahead, a dark shape against the lighter sky. Its windows black, its outline hard-edged in the moonlight. He keeps his eyes on it and moves the way he has been trained to move. Low, steady, weapon up, spacing himself from the man to his left. Nobody runs, nobody speaks. The cold is in his hands and his face and in the steel of the Sten gun, which has taken the temperature of the night and holds it against his palm like something that does not want to be carried. The snow gives everything away, every footstep, every breath. The dark shape of men crossing the white ground in a line that stretches either side of him, each one distinct, each one exposed. If anyone is watching from the villa, they can see all of it. He knows this, but he keeps moving. They're close now, close enough to see the texture of the walls, the edge of the roof, the frame of the window on the upper floor. Nothing moves inside, no light, no sound. The building looks abandoned, emptied out, left standing in the cold like something forgotten. But the plan says it is occupied. The plan says the radar operators are quartered inside. The signal comes, a gesture, passed down the line, and then the first men are at the walls and the assault begins. Not with an explosion or a shout, but with a sudden acceleration of movement. Precise and rehearsed, bodies flowing around corners of the building and towards doors. He follows. His shoulder hits the cold stone of the wall and he swings around the corner and the first sounds of contact reach him. A crash of wood, a door forced open, boots on hard floor. A window above him lights up, not with a lamp, but with a muzzle flash. A single shot from inside, fired down into the yard. The round strikes the frozen ground a few feet to his right and kicks up a spray of snow and grit that peppers the side of his face. He presses flat against the wall. A second shot comes from the same window, wide this time, snapping past overhead and into the dark. Someone beside him drops to one knee, brings his weapon up, and fires twice into the window frame. The second round hits something solid. There is a short, heavy sound from inside, a man falling. And then the window is dark and quiet, and it's over. It's taken perhaps 5 seconds. The cold air still smells of cordite. No one says anything. The assault continues. He goes through the door. The hallway is dark and narrow and smells of plaster dust and something chemical he cannot place. His boots crunch on broken glass. A door to his left is open and he clears it the way he has been taught. Weapon first, body following. Eyes sweeping the corners. Empty. A table, a chair, papers scattered across the floor. He moves to the next room, also empty. The building is hollowed out. Most of the garrison has moved elsewhere, and the silence inside is stranger than the noise outside. He can hear the other men working through the rooms above him, boots on floorboards, a shout of clear, another. At the end of the corridor, a sapper is already pulling a man out of a side room. A German, unarmed, wearing technician's overalls, his hands raised, his face white. The sapper pushes him against the walls and holds him there. The German does not resist. He does not speak. His eyes move from face to face, looking for something. An officer, an explanation, a reason to believe he will not be shot. He is a radar operator. No one expected to capture one alive. At the foot of the stairs, a man lies on his back where he fell from the floor above. The German who fired from the window. His rifle is still in his hands. His eyes are open. Someone steps over him without breaking stride. The villa is theirs. Outside, at the Würzburg, Flight Sergeant Cox is already at work. The antenna looms above him in the dark, the dish tilted at an angle, its mechanisms exposed. He has a torch, he has his tools. He has the sappers kneeling beside him with wrenches and screwdrivers and the folding trolleys they carried in from the drop. He has never touched this machine before. He has studied drawings, photographs, training models built from British equipment, but this is the real thing, and it is not quite what he expected. There is no manual, and the bolts are stiff with cold, and somewhere behind him, the sound of gunfire is beginning to build. It's coming from Le Presbytère. The garrison there has woken up. Drake's men are engaging. But the fire is not staying contained. It's spreading outward, reaching towards the radar site. Rounds snapping past low enough to hear the air split. A bullet punches through the metal housing of the Würzburg and exits the other side with a sharp whine. Another strikes the base of the pedestal and sends a fragment of concrete spinning across the ground. One of the sappers drops flat on instinct, then gets back to his knees and picks up the wrench he let go of. Cox does not move. He doesn't even flinch. He is inside the machine now, pulling at something with both hands, and the world outside of the apparatus has become a problem for someone else to solve. Cox works by torchlight, pulling components free, handing pieces to the sappers, photographing what he cannot carry. He's not dismantling the Würzburg cleanly. There is no time for that. He is ripping out what he can, trusting that the scientists back in England can make sense of whatever he brings them. The receiver unit, the control panel of the parabolic dish, wiring, connectors, anything that looks critical. The sappers load each piece onto the trolleys as it comes free, working in the open, their hands numbed by the cold and the vibration of metal being forced apart. A burst of fire stitches a line across the snow 3 feet from the nearest trolley. Nobody stops, nobody speaks. The work continues. Then he hears a dull thud and one of the sappers goes down. He does not cry out, he simply folds sideways into the snow, his hand still on the wrench, and he does not get back up. The man beside him pulls him clear of the trolley and presses something against the wound. Then he turns back to the bolt he was working on. The gap where the wounded man was kneeling is filled by someone else within seconds. The rhythm does not break. He stands near the edge of the position, facing outward, watching the tree line to the north where the muzzle flashes are flickering. His job is simple now. Stay between the fire and the men working behind him. He does not need to understand what Cox is doing. He does not need to know which component matters and which does not. He needs to watch the dark and keep his weapon ready and hold his ground while the technician finishes, however long that takes. Behind him, he can hear the clang of metal on metal, the grunt of a bolt giving way, the scrape of a component being loaded onto a trolley. Ahead of him, the muzzle flashes are getting closer. The fire from Le Presbytère intensifies, and enemy vehicles are moving in the woods to the south. The time is compressing. Finally, Cox finishes. The trolleys are loaded. Whether what he had pulled free would be enough for the scientists to learn what they needed, no one on the clifftop could say. But it's done, and there was nothing left to take. So Frost gives the order to withdraw. The 3 assault groups, Hardy, Jellicoe and Drake, began pulling back towards the ravine that led down to the beach. The sappers hauling the loaded trolleys through the snow. The withdrawal was not clean. It was not the controlled reverse march of a training exercise. It was men moving as fast as they could across open ground with heavy equipment, the sound of fighting growing behind them rather than fading. A man coming out of the villa door was struck by a round from the enclosure and fell in the snow. He did not move. 2 men nearest to him checked and kept going. There was nothing to be done for him, and there was no time to stop. Frost still had no radio contact with Nelson. He did not know what was waiting for them at the beach. He did not know whether Ross had cleared the coastal defences. He did not know whether Charters and the missing 20 men had arrived, or whether they were still somewhere out in the dark, miles from where they should have been, unable to reach the one position that mattered the most. Everything the raiding force had accomplished, the villa, the radar, the captured technician, was worthless if the beach was not open. And the beach was the only option. There was no alternative extraction point. There was no fallback plan. 100 men, loaded with stolen equipment and a prisoner, were moving towards a strip of sand at the base of a cliff, defended by German pillboxes and machine gun nests. And the last confirmed information Frost had received about that position was that it had not been secured. He committed anyway. There was nothing left to do. The clock that had started the moment the first men had arrived. The The clock that had started the moment the first men left the aircraft was still running, and it did not allow for hesitation. They reached the edge of the ravine and started down. The path down was narrow and steep, and the men moved through it in single file, the trolleys jolting over frozen ground, equipment clattering against rock. Below them, the beach was a thin, pale strip at the base of a cliff, visible in the moonlight. Beyond it, the sea was dark and flat and empty. They came under fire almost immediately. A German machine gun, positioned in a strong point near the base of the cliff, opened up as soon as the first men reached the beach. The position had not been cleared. Ross and his depleted section of Nelson had reached the beach but had not had the numbers to take the strong point. The gun was covering the open ground between the ravine and the waterline, the exact stretch of sand that every man in the raiding force would have to cross to reach the landing craft. The company sergeant major was hit in the first burst. He went down on the sand and was dragged into cover by the men nearest to him. The wound was serious. Others pressed themselves against the base of the cliff, pinned between the machine gun below and the growing sound of German reinforcements moving along the cliff top above. Frost ordered Rodney and the available Nelson elements to deal with the gun, and then, from the darkness inland, Lieutenant Charters and his missing 20 men appeared. They had been dropped 2 miles south of the intended zone and had spent the better part of an hour working their way back on foot through unfamiliar ground, navigating by moonlight, following the sound of fighting. They arrived at the beach exhausted and disoriented, but they arrived, and their additional weight was enough. The machine gun position was suppressed, the beach was open, but the landing craft was not there. The sea beyond the surf line was empty. No boats, no lights, no signal. The men crouched on the beach in the cold, the trolleys beside them, the prisoners sitting in silence among them, and waited. German fire was still coming from the cliff top. The window was closing. Every man on that beach understood what it meant if the boats did not come. There was no second extraction point. There was no path back up the cliff that did not lead into German-held ground. They were at the base of a 400-foot wall of rock on a strip of sand in occupied France, with the tide coming in and the enemy above them, and the only way home was by sea. Out in the channel, Commander Cook and his flotilla had been delayed. 2 German patrol vessels had passed close enough to force the landing craft to cut their engines and drift in silence, hidden against the dark water, waiting for the enemy ships to move on. Cook had received no radio signals from the shore. The same equipment failures that had left Frost blind on the cliff top had also cut the link to the Navy. The only indication that the raid was underway was a single signal flare, fired from the beach and visible for only a few seconds before the wind took the smoke. The flare was enough. Just before 2:30 in the morning, the landing craft came in through the surf. Motor gunboats behind them opened fire on the German positions along the cliff, their shells striking the rock above the beach. For a few chaotic minutes, the men on the sand were caught between the German fire coming down and the naval fire going up, rounds crossing above their heads from both directions. Then, the German guns fell silent, driven back by the shelling or simply overwhelmed, and the paratroopers began to embark. Men waded into the freezing water and hauled themselves over the walls of the landing craft. The trolleys were lifted aboard. The prisoner was passed from hand to hand. The wounded were carried. 6 men did not make it to the boats, separated during the fighting, unable to reach the beach in time, left behind on the cliff top. They would be captured by the Germans within hours. The landing craft pulled away from the beach and made for the motor gunboats waiting offshore. The transfer was made in open water, in the dark. The men climbing from one vessel to another with numb hands and soaked uniforms. Then the flotilla turned north. Destroyers met them in the channel. As dawn came up, a flight of Spitfires appeared overhead, holding station above the convoy all the way to Portsmouth. On board, Frost learned for the first time what happened at sea, the German patrol, the silence from the radios, the long wait in the dark. Cook had come in on the strength of a single flare and his own judgment that the timing was right. Had the patrol vessels lingered another 20 minutes, or had the flare not been seen, the landing craft would not have arrived before the German reinforcements reached the beach. The raiding force reached Portsmouth that morning. 2 men had been killed, 8 were wounded, 6 were prisoners. The components for the Würzburg, pulled free by a radar mechanic who had never seen the machine before under fire in the dark, were intact and waiting for examination. A captured German technician was ready for interrogation. Within days, British scientists had confirmed what they most needed to know. The Würzburg was effective, but it was not as advanced as they had feared, and its mechanisms were simpler than their own. The countermeasures they had been developing would work. The following year, during the bombing of Hamburg, the RAF would drop thousands of strips of aluminium foil from their aircraft, a technique called window. And the German radar screens would turn to snow. The Bruneval Raid was over in less than 3 hours. 120 men had parachuted into occupied France, seized a piece of enemy technology from a defended clifftop, and escaped by sea before dawn. The plan that carried them there had been built on precision. Exact timings, exact positions, exact coordination between air, land and sea. Almost none of it had survived intact. The beach group had landed in the wrong place, the radios failed, the navy was delayed, the withdrawal came under fire from a position that should have been cleared. At every stage, something was not where it was supposed to be, and at every stage, someone made a decision that kept the mission moving. It worked, but only just. Well then, there you have it. If you've listened this far and like what you've heard, consider liking and subscribing. Also hit that notification bell to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, it helps so much, not only in pushing these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but also reassures me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.